Well, welcome everybody, those of you who are able to join us. This is our first session on what is racial capitalism. Tonight we will be have a presentation with Dr. Yarish about what exactly is racial capitalism. And then our second session will be more of a roundtable discussion, sort of talking about what does racial capitalism mean in the contemporary moment. So I'm going to just give a brief introduction, and then Dr. Yarish will then give us a brief presentation, and then we'll have sort of time after to sort of ask questions about any of the material that she has gone over. So if you do have questions during the Q&A, please make sure to type stack in the chat. So without further ado, let us begin. Dr. Yarish is a professional academic and university instructor. She is an assistant professor of political science and coordinator of the Global Studies concentration at the University of the District of Columbia. Her expertise is in the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and democratic theory. Her research aims to extend the idea of abolition democracy theorized by W.E.B. Du Bois to include the political and intellectual contributions made by Black women to the era of Reconstruction, 1850 to 1880. Her archival commitments to revisiting that early period of contemporary political thought, the primary democratization period in American political development, and the unique case of Philadelphia in rethinking the significance of Reconstruction for the discipline of political science and the global place, Dr. Yarish's scholarship as part and parcel of the growing literature on the Third Reconstruction. So with that being said, I would like to introduce you to Professor Yarish.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm looking forward to sharing a little information with you, and then I was going to just open it up to Q&A. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because, I don't know, sometimes things are helpful to see. Also, when we think about ability, it might also be helpful as well to have some words in front of us. So first, I want to start with a quick land acknowledgement. I am currently in the city of Philadelphia. I'm joining you from Philadelphia tonight, even though I'm back and forth between Philadelphia and DC on a regular basis. But I want to acknowledge that the land upon which I currently reside are the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. And I take this opportunity to honor them as the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has resulted in the current iteration of the beautiful Black city that is at the center of my research and which I call home, that is Philadelphia. So in doing so, I identify that settler colonialism and racial capitalism are co-constituent structures of oppression. And I wanted to open with that because I think that a lot of times when we hear the term racial capitalism or we're talking about racial capitalism, it's centered around the Black radical tradition, and that's very much the case, and I will be speaking about that today, but it has a lot of continuations and connections to settler colonial struggles all across the world. So a lot of times when we think about what does the Black radical tradition include, it gets actually very, very global and very much connected to other peoples who might not be identified as Black or identify themselves as Black. So the Black radical tradition and the concept of racial capitalism was largely popularized by Cedric J. Robinson's book, Black Marxism, which came out in the 1980s and has got renewed interest in the 21st century with its second edition published in 2000 by the University of North Carolina Press. And then again, there's actually been another recent third edition that just came out about a year ago. So what I'm going to start with is some terminology overview of a couple of terms so that we have an idea of where we're coming into this conversation so that we can, when we have questions about what does this mean and what does this mean for our current context, we can explore those. So the first term I want to pull out, and that's at the center of what Robinson's doing, is this notion called racialism. Because racial capitalism, it's not racist capitalism, it's racial capitalism. So what is racialism? He says that racialism is the legitimation and corroboration of social organization as natural by reference to the racial components of its elements. Though hardly unique to European peoples, its appearance and codification during the feudal period into Western conceptions of society was to have important and enduring consequences. So what he's really saying here is that racialism is the process by which you have a codification of peoples based off of appearance and based off of their kind of specific ethnic markers that started in the feudal period. And this is really important because racialization precedes the emergence of capitalism in our historical kind of trajectory. So that's a kind of big important point. And what Robinson's going to show, or he shows in his work, is that how that prior racialization codification helped to spurn the success and the kind of entrenchment of capitalism after the anti-feudal struggles, right? The anti-feudal struggles were a moment in history where other options for economic organization could have been possible, but capitalism ended up winning out. So, of course, in racialism is this term called race. So let's just define race real quick. I like to define it as the erasure of ethnic differences. What do I mean by that? Well, Irish is an ethnic category within Europe, but the Irish become white. That's the racialization process. Race is that erasure of ethnic differences. Chinese become Asian, Dominican become Latino, Igbo becomes Black. So again, the idea that all of the differences, the cultural nuance, but the histories of peoples gets erased in these larger codification structures on shared features, phenotypical features typically. Okay, and don't be afraid to throw questions in the chat. So you remember the questions, we'll come back to them. So I would just want to let people know that they can definitely do that. So let's talk about racism. So if racialization is the process by which the codification happens, racism is something that helps reinforce that codification. So it's not simply a convention for ordering the relations of European to non-European peoples, but has its genesis in the internal relations of European peoples. So what's Robinson saying is that racism, or the policing of that codification, precedes contact between European peoples and African peoples. So what he spends a lot of time doing in part one of Black Marxism, for anyone who's read it or looking to read it, this would also be helpful if you haven't started it yet, is he's uncovering the racialization of the Irish peoples specifically. So that's what he spends part one doing. So again, he's trying to show that race, the creation of race, was first targeted towards whiteness. So white is the first race that's codified. And then he goes on to say the Negro, or like Black codifications, whose precedents could be found in the racial fabrications concealing the Slavs, also the slaves, the Irish, and others, substantially eradicated in Western historical consciousness the necessity of remembering the significance of Nubia for Egypt's Rome, and more pointedly of Islam's influence on Europe's economic, political, and intellectual history. So what Robinson goes on to push here is that with the creation of all of Europe becoming white, and therefore all of the European progress being white, erases exactly the kind of connections and the deep histories between Europe and other parts of the world before the concretization of Europe after the feudal period. So the fact that there were slaves in Europe, the term slave, he actually traces to the term Slav, which is referencing Slavic peoples in Europe prior. So once you have the creation of chattel slavery, you no longer have this the kind of enslavement that the history of enslavement, of white enslavement, gets erased, but also the history of Black civilizations and other civilizations other than Europe also get erased. So hopefully I made that clear. Two-part process. So again, I'm not trying to equate, and Robinson's not equating quote unquote white slavery that was happening in Europe prior to the Atlantic slave trade with chattel slavery. He's not doing that at all. He's just saying that with the consolidation of Europe as white, we have the erasure of these deep other histories. Okay, so racial capitalism, what brings us here today? I'm talking about this concept. So he defines racial capitalism on page 2 of the book with the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions so too did social ideology. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent in capitalism. So again, he's showing that racialism and capitalism are kind of mature at the same time. They develop and then mature at the same time. I wanted to pull out 3 different commenters on Robinson's work to kind of like really clarify what he means by racial capitalism. The first is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, human geographer and critical geographer, who writes, or who says in her short, great documentary, Geographies of Racial Capitalism, that was done by Antiimmigrant in 2020, she says, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. So this is another way to think about racial capitalism. We already know that capitalism is based off of inequality because capitalism is an economic ideology that prioritizes profit over the needs of people. So inequality is at the heart of what makes capitalism capitalism. And what Gilmore says, as Robinson shows, is that racism enshrines equality. It is a structure under which capitalism can maintain its power and its kind of development towards more and more inequality. The second figure that I want to point out is Robin D.G. Kelley, historian, University of California, Los Angeles, in his Boston Review piece, where he literally memorializing Robinson's work just after Robinson passed away. He writes, capitalism was racial not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or justify slavery and dispossession, but because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society. Again, Robin Kelley is just reiterating what Robinson has already said. And then finally, I wanted to pull out a more critical read on Robinson's scholarship, but still seeing the value and the concept of racial capitalism. Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, who's professor of Black Studies and Political Theory, now will be at Wayne State University. She's a fellow at the University of Chicago. She writes in her article, Thinking About Racial Capitalism, that was published in Monthly Review in 2020, Blackness is a capacious category of surplus value extraction, essential to an array of political economic functions, including accumulation, disaccumulation, debt, planned obsolescence, and absorption of the burdens of economic crises. Sorry. So what Burden-Stelly is really saying there is that racial capitalism is a concept that's built on Blackness and anti-Blackness, particularly. And she wants to center that in the process of thinking through this idea. Okay, so the last major term I want to make sure I introduce, because this is the term that Robinson focuses most of his energy on in the rest of the book. So he develops this concept of racial capitalism, but what he's really interested in is what he sees as the antidote for racial capitalism. And he calls that Black radicalism. Don't know why I'm dry throat. Anyway, so Black radicalism, he says, is a response to the process of racialization, which he defines as the obscuring of the Black radical tradition is seated in the West's suppression of Europe's previous knowledge of the African and its own past. The denial of history to African peoples took time, several hundred years, beginning with the emergence of Western Europeans from the shadow of Muslim domination and paternalism. And what he says there is, he really introduces this idea of Black radicalism in the introduction. But for those of you who have read or are going to be reading at any stage in your life, Black Marxism, he really unpacks this in part 2 of the book, where he literally shows how the suppression of Europe's previous knowledge of Africa and of its own relationship to Africa and other parts of the world gets obliterated. But what he finds in part 3 of the book, where he uses 3 interlocutors, what he calls the Black intelligentsia, three figures of Black intelligentsia to uncover, is the kind of 3 categories that he uses to measure what does Black radicalism look like. And the first is the absence of mass violence. What he means by that is when there was the moment where Black freedom, Black liberation struggle won out against the dominating white supremacist class, when that happened, or when that happens, there is an absence of mass violence back against white peoples and against those who were very much benefiting from the domination of those peoples. He really looks at, well, not just him, C.L.R. James has noted this in Black Jacobins, Du Bois mentions this in Black Reconstruction, and then also others like Richard Wright in his work on thinking through the kind of responses to white vigilante violence in the South. There's an absence of mass violence on behalf of Blacks, even in the face of mass violence against them. The second major indicator of the Black radical tradition is the tradition and practice of marronage. Marronage, of course, refers to a term of the Maroons. That is Black people fleeing or liberating themselves out of conditions of domination. So that's another example. And then finally, insurrection. Insurrection is another indicator, and this usually happens at moments when mass pressure is being put on a population and the response is a huge insurrection. And that insurrection includes the bringing in of non-Black people into that process. So if we want to think more recently, the largest insurrection that we've seen in US history was the summer of 2020 with the mass protests in the face of the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So insurrection is another big indicator of the Black radical tradition. So finally, why is the Black radical tradition so important for Robinson? It's because these indicators, which are always tend to be read or reread into the archive as non-existent or non-important, their continuous presence throughout history shows that there's a doubt that's put into the history of capitalism itself. So he writes, the Black radical tradition casts doubt on the extent to which capitalism penetrated and reformed social life and on its ability to create entirely new categories of human experience stripped bare of the historical consciousness embedded in culture. So what does that mean? Or how can we think about what he's saying here? So if the idea was to strip away Black history, that, we still have that history still going. We still have evidence of the Black radical tradition still alive today. So that's where we see slippage, is what he's saying. But also the Black radical tradition, he's using that example as a way to show how capitalism is always doomed to failure. It's always doomed to actually kill itself, which a lot of scholars of Marxism actually know this already in Marx's analysis. So Robinson's actually showing that the Black radical tradition can be seen and read as part of what Marx potentially saw as capitalism destroying itself. Now, again, not guaranteed, always potentially in flux. All right, so I've got a couple more slides now that we've dealt with kind of the basic terminology. And I want to bring up racial capitalism and this idea of neofeudalism. And the reason I'm doing that is because probably one of the most preeminent scholars on socialism and communism today is a woman by the name of Jodi Dean. And she's been thinking and theorizing about this concept of neofeudalism for quite some time. And because feudalism and neofeudalism, like capitalism, is a market ideology, how does racial capitalism fit into our world of neofeudalism? So this is reference to a series of articles that Dean has been writing, and she's actually producing a book right now. But there's a public version of her argument that was published in Los Angeles Book Review in 2020, where she kind of outlines what she means by neofeudalism. First, she says capitalism is turning itself into neofeudalism. What does that mean? Well, it tells us that capitalism itself is different from neo-feudalism if it's turning itself into it, right? But also that capitalism is definitely failing at the current moment. If neo-feudalism is something that's radically different, capitalism is failing to capture the things that it wants to claim that it captures. Things like competition, right? The fact that we have very little competition anymore in our economy tells us or indicates to us that capitalism is on its way out. But what are we ushering in? Something that looks a lot like feudalism. She thinks about neo-feudalist tendencies as extreme inequality, generalized precarity, monopolies of power, right? Concentrations of power over markets, but also political power, and changes at the level of the state. So neo-feudalism can be whole countries can be defined as neo-feudalist entities, but also neo-feudalism can exist within very rich countries and even within very rich settings, like cities themselves. So she thinks through concepts of hinterlands to develop this concept further. She quotes, there's another quote from the article, "A property-less underclass will survive by servicing the needs of high earners as personal assistants, trainers, childminders, cooks, cleaners, etc." So these are the ways in which she's kind of indicating neo-feudalists, right? Service. Think of serfs, right? And the old style of feudalism, but now service work has become the primary sector of labor. And that primary sector of labor is very unorganized or disorganized naturally by the way that markets have established it over 10 of decades, if not hundreds of years. She also notes that this is related to another concept that she developed earlier called communicative capitalism. Communicative capitalism is one way of talking about our current stage of capitalism, whether it's information capitalism, community capitalism, or surveillance capitalism. If any of you have heard those three terms, they kind of are around the same idea. The idea that capitalist profit is concentrated in the hands of those who own and control the means of communication and information distribution. So Alphabet City, social media, corporations, etc. So she points to digital platforms. Digital platforms are the new watermills. Their billionaire owners are the new lords, and their thousands of workers and billions of users are the new peasants. Again, this notion of neo-feudalism. She points to particular platforms and like Uber and Airbnb, which extract rent without property by relying on an outsourced workforce responsible for its own maintenance, training, and means of work. Put simply, Uber is the largest taxi company that doesn't own a car. Airbnb is the largest hotel that doesn't own any real estate. So this is the kind of idea that she's thinking through. And of course, this has a link with a long legacy of service labor. And I think this is where we can start to integrate the analysis of racial capitalism that was given to us by Robinson, but also by others that Robinson uses to theorize racial capitalism. And I'm going to point first to one of those figures, W.E.B. Du Bois, who in his first major published piece, The Philadelphia Negro, indicated the devaluation of service labor in US history specifically. It's a long quote, but in it, he's kind of saying that, domestic service, which is something that more and more Black people were getting involved in as they moved to cities, right, in the late 19th century, throughout the 19th century, early 20th century, they entered domestic service, whether that's in individual homes or whether that's in things like hotels. And he says, so long as entrance into domestic service involves a loss of social standing and consideration, so long will domestic service be a social problem. The problem may vary in character with different countries and times, but there will always be some maladjustment in social relations when any considerable part of the population is required to get its support in a manner which the other part despises or affects to despise. The idea is these are, I'm going to use the phrases that we like to use now, unskilled jobs, etc. Even though it takes a lot of skill to be a service worker. In the United States, the problem is complicated by the fact that for years, domestic service was performed by slaves. And this is what Du Bois is actually showing. And afterwards, up till today, largely by Black freedmen, thus adding a despised race to a despised calling, right? Despised race in the American context being Black people's, despised calling being service. Thus, by long experience, the United States has come to associate domestic service with some inferiority in race or training. So again, as I said, unskilled. So the devaluation of service labor has a direct connection to racialization, particularly to slavery, as well as those who were ended up being free, but were boxed of other labor options. We can also point back to the devaluation of service labor going back farther, even to the anti-feudal struggles. And we can do this by looking at Sylvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, where she kind of draws out the history of the development of capitalism and the concentration of capital through the history of primitive accumulation as targeting women through the history of the witch hunts. That's a long way to put a very complicated book very short. But here's an interesting quote from that book that kind of sees the devaluation of service labor being tied to sexualization and gender difference. So the power differential between women and men in a capitalist society cannot be attributed to the irrelevance of housework for capitalist accumulation, an irrelevance belied by the strict rules that have governed women's lives, nor to the survival of timeless cultural schemes. Rather, it should be interpreted as the effect of a social system of production that does not recognize the production and reproduction of the worker as a social economic activity and a source of capital accumulation, but mystifies it instead as a natural resource or a personal service, while profiting from the wageless contributions of the labor involved. Again, the wageless conditions of the labor involved, particularly speaking about women's labor, that is their care labor, but also their reproductive labor, their actual reproduction of the laboring body itself, right? Producing new labors for capitalist consumption. We can get into in Q&A how this feeds into questions about current political decisions by a very anti-democratic institution in our country. Has always historically been anti-democratic, the Supreme Court of the United States. All right, last thing I want to indicate. And this is just looking at today. When we think about the devaluation of service, when we think about this idea of neofeudalism, when we think about this idea of racial capitalism together, we can think about the largest sector of jobs in our country, the one that keeps claiming that they don't have enough laborers, right? That they need help. They can't find good help these days. Sorry, I had to use that phrase. Is the service industry. So this is a breakdown. This is data from Statista, which is probably corroborated from the Bureau of Labor in the United States, and kind of gives the hourly wage of different kind of sectors of food service in the United States. And this data is from last May. So it's about a year old. I doubt that it's moved that much when it comes to the hourly wages. But what we see here is that the largest growing sector of our economy, which is food service and other kind of service industries, is very underpaid. But it's also, if we dig even deeper, less than 2% of all food service, bartending jobs are unionized. That includes coffee shops. So that the collectivization, the social potential for this sector is huge. It's also historically not been possible because nobody wanted to see, or we're still told that it's not valuable labor or valuable work. So that's my last slide. I'm going to end. Oh no, I do have one more slide, but my slide says questions and preliminary answers. So I'm happy to open it up to everybody in the room, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Yarish, for sharing this really sort of informational session. If you have any questions, please type stack in the chat. We'll try to make sure to monitor that. I did want to sort of start off with one question here too. For you, sort of how does Cedric Robinson's conception of racial capital offer a sort of more nuanced understanding of capitalism beyond the ways in which Marx sort of envisioned it in Capital Volume 1? And what ways does he not sort of depart from that Marx?
It's a really good question, because a lot of people are, if you read some of the critiques that are out there of Cedric's work, you see oh, he's completely bashing Marx. Like he's completely saying Marx was completely wrong. And then he's doing something else. But I think that what's really fascinating about Robinson's analysis that's really helpful is to really underscore how global this really was, right? So the fact that capitalism is successful because it's global. Now, that also then means that the response to capitalism also has to be kind of global in a lot of ways. So what I think the nuance that we're getting, I mean, Marx always said, right, you know, even if nobody's read any of Marx and they've only read the Communist Manifesto, the whole point is workers of the world unite. That there is an understanding from the Marxist, traditional Marxist analysis that internationalism is key to fighting back against this thing. But the history of the globe itself, the nuance is lacking in Marx's analysis. And Robinson really wants to give a more robust version of that. I think he's able to do it not because Marx was completely wrong. It's that Marx was not, for lack of a better word, wasn't working with others. Right, he had a writer, right? We have Engels. Let's be honest. Engels is the better Marxist, and Robinson always said that he had a better analysis. He's a better historian. He's the better thinker. But Marx wasn't engaging in collective struggle with ordinary people. He was very much commenting on what he saw in his journalism work and some of the other stuff he was doing in his political work, but he wasn't as involved. And that possibly was because, you know, that time frame didn't have as many technological advancements to make that happen. Robinson's excavating work done by 3 Black intellectuals that were all living most of their life in the 20th century and moving around the world doing this work, right? Du Bois went to China, he went to Russia, he went to Africa, he went to Latin America, he went everywhere and had these conversations with lots of different people. And he also worked not just in the academy, he worked in professional organizing. Again, not perfect, but definitely there. We can say the same thing for James, and we can say the same thing for Richard Wright. Wright, of course, was doing it from a literary lens, right? As opposed to a more social sciencey lens, which we can call like C.L.R. James and Du Bois. However, to use a phrase by another post-Marxist, right, Antonio Gramsci, what Richard Wright had was organic intellectualism because he was part of that working class, whereas like Marx, Du Bois and C.L.R. James were middle class, lower middle class, but middle class nonetheless.
We have a question from Justin and then Lua afterwards.
Oh, cool. So Quentin has a question. Justin first. Did I miss Justin's question first?
Yeah, Justin was in the stack, and then
okay,
Lua
Justin, you go ahead. I think you're muted.
Thanks. This is not quite a question, just maybe another idea around a difference between Robinson and Marx, just for your reaction, Bruce's reaction. And it goes to a slide that you had earlier around what Robinson was saying regarding, and you said I think it has something to do with capitalism wouldn't succeed, or that, you know, that's kind of what's said there, is that Robinson is kind of showing that capitalism will ultimately fail. And I guess another read I would have of what that he was saying in that one comment earlier, and then maybe what the difference is that Robinson is interested in the ontology of Blackness and Black people, that peoplehood is a worthy fight alone, and that capitalism didn't erase the peoplehood of Black people, and that Black people didn't need a materialist analysis in order to insurrect, and that Black people were not outside the formation of history. And that Marx didn't understand that racialism was as fundamental to accumulation as so-called class. And I think that's the that I think is actually the maybe maybe even I would argue like a bigger difference is that Robinson thinks that the ontology of Blackness, what it is to be like, the way Black people see the world, the intersection with spirituality and religion and marriage, that these are all things that are just as, that are critical to and worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's an excellent point, Justin. And I think I'll even push that farther, is that by failing to note that Marx was thinking about capitalism's effect on whiteness, on white people, right? Because if whiteness was the creation of a quote unquote neutral, white history was also erased in this process. And that's what Robinson's saying, is that the complexities of the people that became white get lost. The complexities of Black people also get lost too, but a new thing comes out of that as well, an actual culture, right? As you were saying, an ontology, a history, a struggle, a people, a personhood, a material response, because Blackness couldn't opt out of materiality. It will always be material in the kind of function that the Western idea made it. So I agree with you. I think he's really trying to underscore that these stories are going to always be here. They will always escape the attempt to render them invisible. And the reason for that is because capital has to make them hyper visible in the first place to exploit them. But there will always be slippage, right? There will always be this kind of like slippage that's happening. Does that kind of make sense?
It does, although I'll say one thing and then get out of the way for other folks' comments. I would say that I think he would argue it precedes capital. It doesn't need capital. The ontology doesn't require it to exist. It may morph and take new shapes in this context, but it precedes it. And that'd be my only other comment.
No, yeah, that's what I think you're 100% right. I think I agree with that assessment, that it precedes it, that it will always precede it, that there will always be the Black radical tradition will always be outside of it, and cannot be fully captured, because the way in which capitalism wants to denote Blackness is a very narrow conception, and it's such a robust history that it cannot be captured by that kind of narrowness. So I think that's really helpful. Yes, thank you, Justin, so much.
We're going to move down to Quentin here, who says, do you have any books you would recommend to dive more into this topic? I mean, other than Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, which you've mentioned.
Yeah, no, I think there's a ton of great books. It depends on, Quentin, what your interests are in, right? So I was had to have like a whole list of things based off of where our interests lie. So if Quentin, if you want to let me know, if there's a specific kind of area that you're interested in, I can suggest it. But I also want to suggest some of the people that are out there that are probably really excellent on using or thinking through this term, but don't use it, are people like Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor in her book, Race for Profit. She never uses the phrase racial capitalism in that entire book, but everything she is doing is pointing to how racial capitalism happens. So Race for Profit by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is an excellent book for those of you who are really interested in thinking about racial capitalism through questions of housing, right? Specifically. There's a whole series of essays that are using the concept of racial capitalism to think about it in different lights. And it was a series of essays that came out of a conference honoring and recognizing Cedric's contributions. And it's called The Futures of Black Radicalism, published by Verso, edited by Teresa Gay Johnson, and I'm going to forget the other editor, which is awful. It'll come back to me later. But it's a Verso published book. In there's there are chapters, right? Edited volume. There's a conversation about how racial capitalism fits into thinking through and thinking with the Palestinian conflict, Latin American conflicts, climate change, and the questions of the Anthropocene are in that text as well. So that's a really great book if there's a lot of like little things and pieces you want to dive into. I think, there's also the text that Robinson was really building off of. So we can talk about all of the texts are central to Du Bois, to Sailor James, to Richard Wright, but also Oliver Cromwell Cox, who Robinson literally would say, I did not create this concept, Cox created this concept, called racial capitalism. So those who are really invoking that kind of question, I would also look there. There's a Center for Race and Capitalism at the University of Chicago, directed by Michael Dawson. There's tons of stuff being published through that center on a regular basis. The Center for Race and Capitalism at University of Chicago. Thank you, Alex Lubin. Thank you, Justin, so much. So there's a lot coming out of there and will be coming out of there. And then the other kind of text that I think is, if you're really interested in this idea of neo-feudalism, right? Neo-feudalism requires, or feudalism par excellence requires de-development. So Walter Rodney's the underdevelopment or the de-development of Africa is an important text for this as well. For those of you who want to think less in the context of the Black Atlantic, like our side of the Black Atlantic, I want to think about the other side of the Black Atlantic. I think going to Walter Rodney as a starting point is really important. And then finally, anything written by Claudia Jones, and of course, to the left of Karl Marx, the intellectual biography of Claudia Jones by Carol Boyce Davies is a really important book. And finally, Black women's contributions to thinking and theorizing racial capitalism are really important. And in this coming fall, there will be a new book. It's an edited volume of Black communist women's thinking and writing that is coming out with Verso Press, co-edited by Charisse Burden-Stelly and Jody Dean. And it's looking at Black communist women's writers from the 1920s to like the 1950s. And it's a collection of pieces. So it's an edited volume going to be published by Verso, bringing together an anthology of Black communist women's writing that could be really important. It's called Organize, Fight, Win is the title of the upcoming book. So I have a million, but those are the ones I would go to. Oh, one last one. I want to say one last one for people who are really interested in thinking beyond Europe and maybe even beyond Africa, because I think it's really important for us to also think about imperialist logics as central to feudalism, neo-feudalism entirely. So if we look at Depeche Chakraborty's Provincializing Europe, he doesn't use the term racial capitalism in that text either, and I don't think he cites Robinson at all. However, he's using, he is pushing back on a narrow conception of capital development in the Marxist context, right? So the whole title, Provincializing Europe, he's trying to get the analysis away from Europe and looking at South Asia, particularly India and specific, but we can think about it in those ways as well. So those are the ones I'll go to there. I have a million more, but I'll just stop with there.
Yeah, no, I definitely think there's like many more. Thinking Ruth Wilson Gilmore has her collection of racial capital and geographies of racial capital that's already come out.
Yep.
We can keep going.
Yeah, we could.
One question here from Bree Moeller. Can you discuss how in the US context anti-immigrant discrimination / policies play into a racial capitalist structure? Yeah,
I think, Bree, that's an amazing question. So one of the things that I like to think about here is anti-immigrant discrimination in the history of the US has everything to do with the reinforcement and the reconscription of whiteness. And how do people fit into whiteness or do they not? How can they? Can they ever? Will they ever? Will they not? Have they been then booted out of that category? So if we think about whiteness and the racialization of whiteness, that's how the anti-immigrant discrimination policies play out in racial capitalism, especially. And of course, we always hear I mean, I'm a political scientist by training, even though I'm a political theorist really by training. So I don't do a lot with statistics, but I can play. A lot of times in social sciences, we see when the US economy is doing poorly, there's a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment because of like the ways in which the discourse is. They're gonna come here and take away our jobs. So that kind of language is very, very real. But that's a language that was used in Philadelphia in the 19th century after the emancipation of the former slaves. They even free Black people who were pretty cushy were like, I don't want these people moving into my city. So can people who are racialized as outside of the dominant class contribute to the racialization process and therefore upholding white supremacy? Absolutely, yes, 100%, it happened, and that definitely happens at that point. You know, certain even we think of, there's a real, I'm going to add another book to this. There's a really good book called Cruelty as Citizenship by a political theorist by the name of Cristina Beltran, who theorizes the concept of multiracial whiteness. She's a Latino thinker. She's a Latino political theorist, Latina political theorist, who's thinking about why it is that Latino men are, a lot of them, at the forefront of supporting far-right movements, particularly in the United States right now. And this notion of multicultural whiteness is a really important way to think about the racial capitalist structure and anti-immigrant discrimination, because people who have a history of immigration, who've gone through the immigration process, also can feed into that anti-immigrant sentiment. So I hope that helps a little bit. And then I would push to even further to think about the border itself and this notion of nativism and the question of nativism as part and parcel of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. So Canadian Indigenous scholar Harsha Walia has a really great book on border imperialism that's worth looking at. But I would also say that what we find in reading those texts is that the policing of those borders go well beyond the border, right? And the border becomes this other site of potential rupture and thinking through rupture, and like those kind of logics. So borders are always slipping. When Gloria Anzaldúa, another really fascinating scholar who also kind of thinks along the lines of racial capitalism as well, theorizes the border as a space of opportunity and potential and radical liberation, as well as a site of incarceration and carcerality. So I think it's important that these dual kind of functions, these kind of slipping moments that Robinson talks about, are also apparent in these other kind of traditions, which make them akin to Black radical tradition and not necessarily antithetical to it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. We have Enrique on Stack.
Yeah, hi. Actually, there might be some overlap with your latest response, but it got me thinking. I'm actually from the border. I'm from the Rio Grande Valley, the southern tip of Texas. And, you know, your last response kind of got me thinking about how, you know, as of late, I guess the area that I live in has been of kind of like renewed political interest for people that study electoral politics, because our communities are you know, predominantly Hispanic or people of Mexican descent, and well, the electorate has recently turned out in growing numbers for the Republican Party, and of course they're kind of, you know, led by an open racist that doesn't, you know, shy away from talking about Mexicans and other Latinx people in blatantly racist ways. So I was wondering, wanted to hear your thoughts on how, I guess, an understanding of racial capitalism theory can help to explain that kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, also, yeah, if we miss Lula's question, we'll come back to it as well. I'll spend enough time to stay back. But Enrique, I think that's a really good point. One of the things I want to talk about real quick, because, you know, I have to, the intersection between racial capitalism, fertility, and like these kind of bigger questions of family. I think that that's one of the ways in which this gets described. The definition of family, the definition of reproductive value and when I say reproductive, I really mean human reproduction at this stage, I think is really important, is key. So one of the ways that I see the or the capture of the Republican big R, not small R, big R Republican Party in the places like South Texas, where you're from, and the border, there is the fear, but there's also this kind of pushing into a threatened tradition, right? Like tapping into Catholic, tapping into anti-abortion, tapping into the notions of family as being very important. And also like how historically immigration policies and liberal, small L liberal immigration policies in the United States have been always attached to family. So if you come legally, you can potentially bring other people legally with you after the fact because you're married to them. But that marriage had to be heterosexual. It had to be very explicitly in those realms. So when we think about disrupting racial capitalism, we have to think about not just the racial component, but the sexual component as well, because race historically has been policed through sexuality. We think about the white women in the 18th century losing their citizenship because they married or fell in love with or had children with Black men, free or enslaved or not, didn't matter, or indigenous men, right? They lost their citizenship, they lost their rights to be deemed white, and that became a policing of whiteness. So I think that it's contingent upon us to think about race as not an individual marker, but a social project that is maintained through mechanisms of control through things like sexuality, and how that's going to be harder and harder to do as certain rights are being eroded. But of course, we can also then question, why are they happening right now? So I think that those traditional elements are not explicitly captured by conservative movements, but are being tapped into because there is there's an infrastructure, particularly within the Catholic Church, that has had a long game to maintain a certain kind of control. And I only say that not to be anti-Catholic, because I'm sitting in Philadelphia and know that history, but the Supreme Court is dominated by Catholic readers and Catholic jurists right now. And that plays out in how the law is being rewritten. I ended up finding an answer to my questions. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah. No, your response made me think a lot of Ian Haney Lopez's book, White by Law, in which he discusses that sort of very same thing about how, up until a certain point, white was a way you gained citizenship, right? You literally had to prove you were white to become a citizen, and that how that sort of shift demographics and who became into the country and that sort of thing. So it's interesting to think in terms of racial capitalism, how much whiteness and white supremacy become integral to racial capitalism. I guess I wonder if you could speak more on that.
Yeah, I think that this is Robinson's, and this is where we get into, all right, I'm going to get into my political ideology brain. So a lot of what I was saying earlier is I said like capitalism, feudalism are economic ideologies, right? And then there are these kind of like political ideologies. And then there's other kind of ideologies that are out there. But white supremacy is a project that maps onto a political ideology, right? That political ideology is called fascism. Let's be clear. Fascism is a political ideology that determines a specific category as dominant. And it's a racial category that is maintained through a specific kind of sexual performance rooted in patriarchy and masculinity and misogyny. So if what we're seeing happening now is a combination of a fear around capitalism's failure, right? Interestingly enough, fascism became really prominent at another time in history when capitalism's failure was pretty much imminent as well. So it's a way of shoring up capitalism for a certain amount of time. But again, for very few people. So I think that racial capitalism allows us to theorize both anti-communism and fascism as being co-constitutive. That's why I think what Charisse Burdenstelli and Jody Dean have done in creating this volume and like showing Black women have always theorized those together. Right? Because socialism was the thing that made fascism possible. Socialism was deemed effeminate and it was emasculating, and it was this thing, this project that was bringing people together and making people equal, and that meant men were becoming, you know, equal to women and therefore more effeminate. And then fascism shows up. If we read any Mussolini, if we read any Hitler, if we read any of them, we see this enforcing of a very specific kind of masculinity. So socialism and then communism, right, the economic ideology that goes with socialism, for success, right, if we're in the democratic socialist of America, and so we're speaking in that kind of project, for success has to take into consideration what is gender equity, what is racial equity. If we don't think about, and then also sexual equity, what if we don't think about those three things together, something's going to fail. And that doesn't mean thinking about them as predetermined identities that can be wielded in a way that can be co-opted by those who are anti-socialist, right? Those are pro-capitalist. But that the sexual, gender, racial projects, the liberatory projects, are a collective endeavor. And that's how we can potentially get post-identity politics if we choose to do so. But to reinscribe one identity as being more important than the other plays into a fascist hands, including if we become class reductionist, is kind of like where I would end that point on. And that's why it's really important that we think about a concept that's as rich as racial capitalism, because it allows us to do that. And I think Robinson would be the first one to say that this is a small d democratic project, but it's also a big F democratic project. And by a big F, I mean it's a feminist project. We'd like to think there's a lot of criticism about Robinson's work of not engaging in a lot of women's thinking, but he opened the door for us to do that work. And we can be doing it more effectively now. And I think that there's foundation and groundwork being laid to do that kind of work. And Black women have always been there doing it at the forefront anyway. We just need to keep listening and centering their work, which is why I'm working on a book on their work currently.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has just been really amazing and informative. Again, we'll make sure to get this recording out to those who've RSVP'd. But again, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Yarish, for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with us and talk about this really important topic.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and thank you all for your great questions. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to email me. I threw my email in the chat, and I'm happy to send more references to anybody's way.
Okay. All right, then. Well, with that being said, wish all of you a good night.
Good night, everyone.